During the commemorations that happened earlier this morning at those kibbutzes that border the Gaza Strip, rockets came in from that territory, and airstrikes in return going the other way, most notably hitting Khan Yunis and the Jabalia refugee camp. With us, he lived as a boy for a time at Jabalia. Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's a pretty grim picture. You just heard our correspondent talking about the fact that, you know, the war is expanding 1 year on, and the talks are at a standstill. So, who can change this dynamic at this point?
I think it is unfortunately accurate that at this point, Yahya Sinwar hasn't the slightest of interest in ending this war because he knows there'll be a reckoning with Hamas. The people of Gaza have turned against the terror group en masse after inviting the most destructive war in Palestinian modern history on the Gaza Strip. Over 2 million people displaced, tens of thousands killed, generations decimated by the Aqsa flood, which was meant to free a few thousand prisoners. And now we have over 10,000 prisoners. We have just utter destruction and annihilation. And so, unfortunately, he is waiting for the expansion of the war exactly as things appear to be heading. He forced Nasrallah until he was alive. He forced the Houthis. He forced Iran to act on behalf of Hamas, and a year later, sadly, he appears to be getting what he wanted.
Appears to be getting what he wanted. There's also the criticism going the other way, that back on July 31st, just when truce talks were going at a low simmer, let's say, there was the assassination of the head of the political wing of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran. Is it also the Israelis making sure that there's no end?
Well, there's absolutely a ton of truth there as far as Prime Minister Netanyahu, unfortunately, not wanting this war to end so that he can remain in power, so that he can try to wrong what was basically the biggest security failure in Israel's history that he owns. I mean, he went from a security-centric prime minister and leader to all of a sudden owning the biggest disaster that the Jewish people have faced since the Holocaust, single-day disaster since the Holocaust. Netanyahu could potentially have ended this with had he not opted for the delay tactic of insisting on the Philadelphia corridor. And we know that that's the strip of land along Gaza's border with Egypt that has historically been used for smuggling, but many of the tunnels there have been inactive for years. And so you had Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, and a whole host of Israeli security leaders saying to Netanyahu, we do not need physical control of the Philadelphia corridor. But this was merely a stalling tactic so that he knew that Hamas would say no. He knew that Hamas has been insisting on a full withdrawal of Israeli troops. And so you have the people of Gaza, my family and what remains of them. I lost over 31 of my immediate and extended family. Both of my childhood homes have been destroyed. I've lost contact with so many of my surviving family members. My brother is in there right now managing. He's a senior director for an international NGO. The horror, the layers upon layers of misery, displacement, hunger, and suffering. And you have the people of Gaza trapped between a ruthless terror organization led by Sinwar and a merciless, nefarious Israeli government led by Netanyahu with no way out.
With no way out. And it's a day where Israelis are commemorating their trauma. You point to your personal story and the fact that, for the Gaza Strip, it's been a year of hell.
Precisely that. And listen, I've had the privilege of connecting with so many Israeli and Jewish allies throughout this year, including even just around the commemoration of the tragedy, the tragic 1 year mark since October 7th. I've connected with hostage families and have been a steadfast ally in pushing for the release of their loved ones. I've connected with survivors and victims of October 7th, and been wanting to use our camaraderie, if you will, around this suffering as an opportunity to break away from the vicious cycle of hatred, incitement, revenge, rinse and repeat. I have used the last year as an example for why Palestinians and Israelis' fates are intertwined. And I understand. I was listening to your earlier guest. I understand what he was saying. I hear the hurt, the pain, the sense of betrayal. But we must remember that the people of Gaza have been isolated for almost 20 years now. 70% of Gazans have never left the Gaza Strip. Gaza is a mini North Korea in the sense that between Egypt and Israel on one hand, restricting freedom of movement, and then between the clutches of Hamas on the other hand, this is not a society that has had its fair opportunity to truly develop, to truly prosper. And yes, education is something that people talk about all the time. I believe in de-radicalization. At the same time, people are a product of their environments. And when they've been subjected to wars and restrictions and a ruthless terror organization that has corrupted the social fabric, this is what we're stuck with. And I remain hopeful that after this war, there will be multiple opportunities for healing and reconciliation, as well as genuine development and reconstruction, not just turning Gazans into aid-dependent subjects.
Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib, one final question for you. You're in Washington. Why hasn't U.S. President Joe Biden upped the pressure? Remember that first week when he went to Israel and he said, watch out, we have a cautionary tale in what happened to us in Afghanistan and Iraq. Don't overreact. Why hasn't he been more forceful?
Well, I think there are multiple things happening here. I think there's a fragmentation of who's really making the decisions, and between the White House, the National Security Council, the State Department, the Special Envoy's office. So there's just a lack of clarity as to who really controls the administration's decision making when it comes to this war. I also think the fact that we're coming up on one of the most consequential presidential elections in U.S. history has a lot to do with how far the administration thinks they can push without alienating the Jewish vote, without alienating Israel and its allies. I also think there's just a lack of clarity as to what is the way out of this. There's talk about a reformed Palestinian Authority. Then there's talk about an internationally led transitional period, which I personally support. The United States, unfortunately, has not taken on a leadership role in shaping the post-war era. There have been U.S. officials have been reluctant to leveraging the billions of dollars that we've given to Israel in military aid to extract concessions from Prime Minister Netanyahu to bring down the temperature, to try to contain the crisis. And instead, we've basically given him a blank check. And by the way, I support giving Israel defensive aid. At the same time, as an American who loves our country and believes in a balanced foreign policy, I also support us leveraging foreign aid that we give out to our allies to serve our foreign policy interests.
Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib, so many thanks for joining us from Washington. Stay with us. There's more to come. We'll cross to our correspondent, Rawad Taha. He's in Beirut with the latest as the war there between Israel and Hezbollah seems to be expanding. He'll tell us more.